All right, everyone, welcome back to another edition of SpectrumCast. We're moving along our Data Resilience SpectrumCast, and here we are again with our co-host, Randy Arsenault, and our longtime supporters, Tricia Jang and Sean Sperry. Great to have you guys all back. This week, what we wanted to talk a little bit about was how the cloud, I think we ended last week talking a little bit about how the cloud and data in the cloud can affect your business if it's not monitored and paid attention to in the right way. So we thought we might drill down into that a little bit and talk about data protection in the cloud. And in doing some research for this particular presentation, we found that the growth in data moving to the cloud, specifically around data protection, is going to grow 135% over the course of the next 5 years. So from roughly around $2.5 billion to almost $7 billion. And I wanted to possibly ask Tricia and Sean, are you hearing kind of the same things from folks that you're talking to about moving protection assets and backing up to the cloud or utilizing the cloud for data protection or data resilience? Are you hearing that from clients as well? Tricia, what do you say?
Totally. We're hearing it all over the place. And what's kind of interesting is different parts of the world are adapting it at different rates. But you see these people looking at, first of all, having workloads out there that they want to protect. So being able to protect the pieces in the cloud. Then talking about moving the Spectrum Protect or Spectrum Protect Plus servers into the cloud to protect those versus a hybrid. And so we get all these different mixes and matches of what we're protecting and how we're protecting it and where in that transition people are at.
Sean?
Yeah, I mean, I agree, but I would also say that IBM's customers tend to be, as a group, somewhat conservative. Right? So you see a lot of the customers and a lot of the people I deal with who are keeping things in the data center or perhaps segmenting new projects that are running data on the cloud side, but leaving their old legacy workloads running in the data center or where they are. So I don't see a lot of this. The term the marketers love to use is lift and shift, right? And I personally don't see a lot of the lift and shift going on among our customers. It's more segmented new types of projects, or maybe things like email, like maybe trying Office 365 or moving the email servers there, but not just en masse taking their whole data center and moving it.
Yeah, more like net new stuff is going out there and not necessarily legacy workloads.
Yes. Yeah.
But those net new still have to be protected, and that's where people are starting to look at, well, how do I protect those pieces that are in the cloud? Am I going to do a hybrid, or am I going to have a second server out there protecting those pieces?
So I really like how we're positioning this. So Sean, I think you bring up a really important point. And over the scope of this, let's talk about this a little bit. So when clients say they want to back up to the cloud or back up in the cloud, right? A lot of times you have to kind of drill into that and try to understand what they mean, right? There are, in my mind, there's a few different categories of what this means, right? There is, first, I want to back up to the cloud. So I've got my traditional data center on-prem, and I want to be able to take that protected data, and maybe I've gotten rid of tape, or maybe I want to have a third copy offsite, the 3-2-1 premise around data protection. I've got my local copy for operational recovery, but I want to put a copy in the cloud, right? There is, I want to replicate to the cloud. So a lot of folks who might not be able to afford 2 major data centers for disaster recovery, but they're utilizing the cloud for DR, maybe they want to replicate a copy of their data to the cloud. There's backup on the cloud, and this is a very, very small use case, right? And we can do this with Spectrum Protect Plus, but it's probably not the most seen solution, where I can run Spectrum Protect Plus in the cloud, and all of my applications are running on-prem. So think of the one that comes to mind is a mining operation where we've actually sold this solution. So they've got a bunch of different mines, and those are being managed from a Spectrum Protect Plus solution in the cloud, where we're actually backing up on-prem. and then maybe we can replicate that data to the cloud and have a common repository. But on-prem, it's a local protection, local snapshot with Spectrum Protect Plus, and a local recovery. And then finally, the final use case would be the protection of applications in the cloud, taking advantage of my data protection application and the application I'm protecting, both running in the cloud, right? So that's backup, what I would say, in the cloud. Now, Sean, you brought up something really interesting, right? It's how do clients typically go from making a decision around which way do they want to do protection, right? Do I want to do a backup to the cloud? Do I want to backup in the cloud? Am I thinking about a disaster recovery scenario in the cloud? What are some of the things that clients go through to think about how they pick which one they want to do?
Well, I mean, when I look at this slide, a lot of it depends on the problem you're trying to solve in the use case, right? And I mean, you can come at it in a lot of different ways. Like, for instance, when I look at the case all the way on the left, the backup to on-prem with applications in the cloud, I think that depends on how many applications you have in the cloud, right? If this is a first-time experiment or only a small part of your workload is in the cloud, then that one on the left makes sense, right? Whereas if you're a brand new business or you have all of these projects where all of the workload is running on the cloud, then I mean, why would you want to move that data on-prem, right?
So as the resident non-data protection expert on the Data Protection Podcast, I look at it as, when I think of the cloud implications of backup, the first thing that comes to mind is that, I think it's still true that the cloud backup is the largest single application and producer of data on all public clouds, right? Backup or archive in some form, right? So, I mean, I sort of look at backup to cloud, and I'm using that in my very simple, generic terminology, is something that I think everybody's doing to some degree, or just about everybody, maybe not so much large enterprise customers, but it strikes me that it's massively, proliferated across organizations everywhere. So where it gets, the slide depicts other scenarios where the brains of the operation are either behind the firewall or sitting up in the cloud. So I view that as kind of the distinction. It's like, what are the times when, or what are the use cases for which having the brains of the operation sitting in your data center versus having it, sit out in the cloud? I mean, again, that's my sort of backup for dummies thought on it.
And I think this also starts to make these companies think about the new type of disaster recovery scenarios that are available to them and that they need to consider. So yeah, now I can back up to the cloud or maybe archive out to the cloud for long-term retention of my on-premise data. So that's one great disaster recovery scenario. But what about, like last week when we talked about these applications where suddenly they're shut down because they were running in the cloud? How were they protected, and how are they going to restart in a different location? So how are you backing up and protecting those applications so they're not solely dependent upon that one cloud provider?
Yeah, that's a great point. So it's all that to me seems like the inverse of backing up to the cloud. So you're running in the cloud, you have a cloud native application or workload set, and you want to periodically snap that data and bring it on-prem. So you've got like an archival copy of it in your control, like in your physical custody. And I don't even know if that's a common practice, but it strikes me that it probably should be.
Well, I mean, you could, like, if you look at the second column, the replicate to, you can also replicate from, right? I notice you don't have any arrows pointing in any direction there, right? So, one of the ways you might address what you were talking about is to take the data that's already in the cloud and replicate it back to your data center.
There you go.
But, the replication part is really a consideration for, to me, your classic DR recovery play, right? And in the old days, the top used to be site A and the bottom used to be site B, right? You just happen to own the two. Now it's on-prem is your site and the cloud just happens to be somebody else's data set.
Yeah.
And you know, that's something that actually worries me, because if you are archiving, especially like for long-term retention or regulatory requirements out to the cloud, and suddenly either that cloud provider goes at a big platform or charges you too much, how are you going to move that massive amount of data to the location?
So Amazon's been trying to kind of plant their flag in the data center for 20 years. And one of their previous attempts at it was, back up all your data to us, give us your archives. Doesn't matter how big it is, we'll, spin it into a deep archive. And if you ever need to do an emergency recovery, we'll essentially implement truck mode, where we'll like load a bunch of tapes on a truck or put them in a plane and, send them to you, which arguably is the only practical way you could do it, unless you've got, dark fiber point to point or some ultra high bandwidth network connection, right? So, I mean, that's another issue, is just the volume of data that we're talking about.
And there's holes and flaws in that process too, right? So what type of tape does that client have? A tape to be able to put, have a tape library to pull that particular type of data off, right? I mean, there's all kinds of hurdles, which brings up another question. And I'm curious, we actually got our first question from the internet over the course of this week, having to do with this exact topic, right? And so I'm curious what we think when it comes to, in these different scenarios, the backup to, the replicate to, the backup on or backup in, are we talking to the same person when it comes to delivering this type of solution, or are there different people involved? And maybe before we answer that, Sean, when you said that this whole, we don't see a lot of lift and shift, and I having been in technology for 20 plus years, I agree with you, right? I tend to think we see folks, they have a new project and they want to implement new solutions, new innovative solutions to solve that particular problem. That might have an effect on the different people we talk to in these different scenarios. True?
Oh yeah, I said I don't see a lot of lift and shift, right? And remember, for me, I tend to talk to existing IBM customers in many cases, right? And many existing IBM customers are just, I mean, they have a solution, particularly in these legacy applications, that works, right? And in many
Nothing
cases,
is stickier than backup, right?
Yeah, exactly. Or something that works, right?
Yeah.
It's the classic, if it ain't broke, don't fix it type of thing. But yeah, so it all depends. I mean, obviously, if you're Parlor, as we talked about last week, right, you're not lifting and shifting anything, right? You're just starting from scratch and starting small, and that makes perfect sense.
Born in the cloud, which most new business ventures are these days, unless they're in some kind of a physical, manufacturing or production business. That does set up that interesting situation where, as Tricia said, all of your data, like the crown jewels, are sitting out on the public cloud somewhere. What happens if there's a massive, disruption of service, or they go out of business, or there's a government intervention or whatever, some kind of a massive cyber attack? What do you do? Like, what's your path forward?
I guess for me, when you showed that first slide, Steve, for me, when you read about the growth in the cloud, some people might interpret that as, well, the data center is dead, right? And I don't know that I necessarily believe that any more than I believe a lot of other things are dead, right? I just think it's a different set of use cases, a different set of workload in many cases, not all, but in many cases.
Your workload that's overlooked, it has to be something that your backup administrator is considering and looking into who in their corporation is using the cloud for what purposes, and is that data being protected, and is there a DR plan for it?
More shadow IT.
Yeah, I think beyond the last use case, right, which is new applications born in the cloud, driven by lines of business, driven by development, who need tools to put in place to do protection. I think a lot of the other ones fall into the traditional category. I'm evolving slowly. I'm getting rid of tape. I'm doing something else. Tricia, does that kind of align with what you're seeing, and is that kind of the same groups of people that we've been talking to for years when it comes to protecting information?
Yeah, that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing it's these people that are concerned, because a lot of the people that are just using the born in the cloud apps are thinking, the vendor will take care of this backup. And they're
Mhm.
not seeing the big picture of what we just talked about that could happen, to cause even bad scenarios where that whole vendor goes out of business or has an attack or something.
Well, and I'm sure, I mean, I have never signed one, but I have to believe that the terms of service and the contractual agreement that you enter into with your provider has some provision for, in the event of a catastrophic failure, like you can drive to this address and get a tape or something. I mean, it just seems like there would have to be some kind of a fail-safe mechanism built into that. And again, I don't know, but I'm assuming there if there isn't, there should be.
Clients who have decided they're going to move away from maybe what they consider legacy technology. I say that only because tape might be considered legacy. We've heard that story tape is dead for years. We're actually seeing a lot of clients who got rid of tape actually bring tape back, all because of the whole cyber resilience and true air gapping set of capabilities. But those folks starting to look at cloud capabilities to be able to move data to the cloud. We see a lot of smaller businesses that never had a disaster recovery plan because they felt they were small enough start to implement one, be able to utilize the cloud. I think the tools in the cloud are giving those clients better capabilities at a more affordable set of costs to be able to build that out and not have to go build a second data center, Sean, like you were saying. In the old days, it used to be primary up top, secondary down bottom, but now we're utilizing the cloud. And then what I am seeing is that the conversation shifting to a different group of people when it comes to the born in the cloud applications. But I think that's kind of the nature of the business.
I do see for DR in the cloud is if you do have your backups as well as like your Spectrum Protect database out in the cloud, that does give you a lot of flexibility on where you restore your Spectrum Protect server to or your Spectrum Protect Plus server to, because that cloud should be accessible from almost any location worldwide. So that is one really nice advantage.
Maybe not fast, but at least accessible, right? God forbid you should have Steve's internet connection. You'd really be in trouble.
No kidding.
Just shut it down, padlock the door, hang out the sign.
Get in your truck and drive to go pick up some tapes, right?
Right.
So one of the things we don't frequently do during this podcast is kind of pound our chest about IBM solutions and technology. The whole premise here is to really think about thought leadership around what's happening within the industry around these particular things. And this one happens to be data protection in the cloud. But one of the things that I'd like us to maybe talk a little bit about is in a lot of the new enablement that I was doing for our IBM sellers and our IBM business partners, because they had asked us, what does IBM have for solutions around data resilience for the cloud? We put together a matrix. And when we got done, I was like, wow, this is pretty impressive, right? We have, aside from the fact we have a couple of different solutions, Protect and Protect Plus, as well as a Spectrum CDM that can move data to the cloud. We actually cover the major cloud players, unless you would call Alibaba a major player, but from the IBM cloud to AWS to Azure to Google Cloud, we play in these arenas pretty significantly with a lot of different feature functions. And it was impressive to me from the standpoint of, I would get a question from the field, hey, what do we do in this particular scenario? And would go scramble and we'll put together, here's what IBM does for Azure. And that's one small segment of the overall cloud marketplace. It doesn't seem very impressive, but when you put it all together on a sheet of paper, it's actually pretty impressive, wouldn't you say, Sean?
Yeah, I mean, I first of all, I really like this slide. I think it does a great job of communicating exactly that we support all of these clouds, because we've really been doing this. I mean, this is not new to us, right? We've been doing this for the last 4, 5, 6 years, right? And just adding capability after capability in our set of products. But the other thing I like about this slide is kind of what we started this session with, was that people kind of talk about the cloud, but they're not very specific. And look at the capabilities there on the left, it kind of lists them all out and shows which cloud providers we support them on and which products we support them and how we support them. So I think it's very impressive and puts it all together in one place where you can see it very easily.
Yeah, I'm definitely I'm a huge fan of those kind of, you know, traffic light matrices like this. We use them a lot, and I think it's effective because you can communicate not only a lot of information in a fairly compact area, but you also do a really good high level competitive, you know, positioning, again, in a very small amount of real estate. So yeah, this is really good.
You know, I would also say too that this kind of is what you would expect from IBM, in the sense that we're going to support IBM Cloud because it's our technology, right? It's our marketplace, it's our business. And then you look at, what are we going to do next? Well, it's the one with the most market share, right? And that's AWS. Yeah. And we're now getting ready and going into Azure very heavily and just starting to add capabilities for Google Cloud.
And I like this overview slide, and I think actually there's tons of depth behind that. I know I was speaking at the AWS conference and had a whole session just on how we work with Azure and all the details, as well as some of the things that aren't showing up on the slide, utilizing some of their built-in tiering capabilities and stuff like that. So I agree with Sean, there's a lot of functionality and a lot of depth.
I think what's really important to take away is we tried when building out this content to say, you know, what are a lot of the questions that folks ask us about? But I think it's really important to point out, Tricia, not only in each one of the categories is there a whole list of capabilities that we could probably do that tie to both the provider as well as what's in the product already. That's important to ask if you're a client, to ask your seller or business partner about. But in addition, we continue to build this out daily. So Sean, as you mentioned, right, you're going to see an announcement come out pretty soon about what Spectrum Protect Plus does in the Azure cloud and have it be available in the Azure marketplace. And today you don't see a lot of Protect Plus in the Google Cloud, but that's kind of next on the roadmap. And we continue to fill in also other feature capabilities in AWS cloud within Protect and Plus as those things come up from our client base asking us, hey, can we do this? Could you support this? And that type of thing. So again, I just wanted to kind of point out, I think it's fairly impressive. We do spend a lot of time putting together solutions for the cloud and that sort of thing.
I would also say too, that our customers are working pretty much in exactly the same way, in the sense that when it comes to all of these cloud providers, what you'll typically see is a statement of direction, right? We're moving to AWS, we're moving to Azure, we're moving workload there, but they don't just snap their fingers and get there overnight, right? I mean, this is something that's happening over a period of months and years.
So this week I came across an interesting news story that broke about the level of GDPR fines that are being levied or have been levied within the past year. So DLA Piper did a study where they looked at late January 2020 till now, and took a look at activity on GDPR in terms of audits and fines, and it was really, and I suppose you could argue it's probably not surprising given where we are in the world and the pandemic, but it was the numbers were pretty staggering. So there have been 158.5 million euros in fines and penalties, which is about $192 million at current conversion, and that's a 39% year-over-year increase. So interestingly, as people were more data dependent, arguably, being kind of confined and quarantined and not as able to interact in the workplace, there was a lot of personal information that was being flown around the wild interwebs, and it resulted in a lot of breaches. And it also, I think, demonstrates that they're very serious about maintaining this standard and maintaining this compliance. The other thing that I thought was kind of interesting as I read a little bit further into it is that within the U.S., there has been a lot of, sort of people requesting similar GDPR style regulatory, policies and procedures and kind of a similar regime. And it's interesting because a lot of the biggest offenders are American companies, right? So whether it's Google or Blockbuster, others that get these big, Marriott that get these big penalties and big fines are U.S. based companies operating in Europe and operating in the EU. So it's just kind of an interesting dichotomy, right? So it touches on a lot of the things that we've spoken about, in these weekly talks. Data sovereignty, data protection, privacy, resiliency, all of those things. And it's, companies will be taking it a lot more seriously when it's, hitting them in the wallet, right? So, and it very clearly is, and it seems to be on the upswing. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting observation.
And I think this fits in really well with the topic from last week where we talked about classifying data. So if you've classified that data ahead of time before you're going out and storing it or whatever, you really know, hey, this is stuff that falls under GDPR,
Yep.
regulatory requirements. I've got to take these extra steps to make sure I'm extra sure about data breaches or how long it's being kept and other pieces.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's driving, GDPR is kind of on the leading edge of privacy protection and, personal privacy. There have been some really interesting court cases around the world and even in the US of the concept of, the right to be forgotten, right? So you can request that any entity with which you do business or conduct business, if they have personal information on you at any time, you can demand that information be removed from their system. And there was another interesting case. It was actually a guy, it was in Ohio. There's a newspaper, one of the Cleveland newspapers publishes, like essentially the police blotter, basically like crimes and, things that are reported, publicly. And this guy petitioned to have his record expunged from their archive because he had, done some bad things and sort of did some time, but now he had, got his life back together. He was a successful businessman. And he's like, hey, when people Google me, like, I don't want them to know that I, went to jail for selling drugs in college. And he took it to court. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. And they eventually said, yeah, you have a right to have that, even though it's public information, you have the right to request that provider expunge that from their archive. And that comes straight out of GDPR. That's one of the primary tenets of GDPR. So we're going to see more of it. No question about that.
I also think what's pretty interesting is that used to be, so that's one of the primary tenets I use when talking to clients about taking advantage of Spectrum Discover with Spectrum Protect. So because I can actually go in and have a look at the catalog and find out all of the information, and I can find out, I have information that I've backed up about, John Doe for the bank, and they have asked that they have the right to forget who I am. It's not just on the primary system, right? I got to forget who they are in the backup system too, because if I do a recovery a month later and that person shows up, well, I'm not following the law, right? So that's a great opportunity.
It's a great point. And there's a huge chain of custody and audit trail question that goes along with that. So yeah, you're absolutely right. If you don't have the ability to do that, then you're not legally compliant. So
I'm wondering, Randy, GDPR seemed like when it was all kind of ramping up, very similar to the Y2K thing. And I'm sure because Y2K, nothing really major happened, the level of seriousness that companies applied to GDPR. Now I know at IBM, we took it very, very seriously. And I'm sure you don't see a lot of European companies listed in this particular list, although I'm sure, it's $158 million in fines. I'm sure there are some. I'm curious, like, do we think that the level of how serious different people took it is now essentially starting to come out because they hadn't been penalized before?
Well, it's kind of a chicken and egg, right? It's a good question because if you look at a 39% year-over-year increase in penalties, assessed and penalties paid, that would indicate not necessarily that people are taking it more seriously. It might indicate they're taking it less seriously, or it indicates that enforcement is on the rise, which is more likely what's happening. So I think, as with most policy shifts like this, it's not a switch. They don't just throw the switch and start automatically, setting the clip level and, penalizing everyone who goes over it or steps over the line. But I think, my sense is that the regulatory agencies at the EU now are saying, and the UK as well, are saying, look, you've had enough time to get it together. We gave you fair warning. We're going to start levying these fines and penalties, and the honeymoon's over, I guess. So I think it's more that the compliance is ramping up than it is that companies are necessarily adapting the way they operate. And maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's kind of the sense I get.
I think you're right. It's probably a little bit of both, right? Oh, great.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah. And frankly, it reinforces when the fines are this dramatic and this public and this onerous, obviously that reinforces, better behavior and encourages companies to be more compliant.
Gives incentive.
Yeah.
Yep. On the other hand, companies like Google and the big Apex, providers, it's, that's SOFA change to them, so they can just continue to operate with impunity and just pay the fine. So, we'll have to see how that goes.
Yeah. Well, team, great. I think this week was a great call. I like the in the news portion here that talking about this, and maybe we can carry that forward and talk more about compliance on a later SpectrumCast. But I want to thank everyone for their time today. I appreciate it, and have a wonderful day.